Hello again. Welcome to our lecture on fiction. Just a warning, this will probably be a longer video than we're used to, and that's just because um, there's a lot to cover. Unfortunately, because the semester is so short, there's no way for me to really break this down into smaller units. So I recommend maybe uh, pausing when you feel like your brain is on overdrive and coming back to the video at a later time, because everything we're going to talk about is super important both to writing short stories and to writing plays. So let's get started. First thing we want to figure out is what fiction is. So it is a genre of creative writing. It's the second of 3 genres that we're covering in this class. Fiction is text that has a beginning, middle, and end. It has a conflict. There are many genres of fiction. There are many forms of fiction. The form that we're focusing on this semester is the short story form. However, there are novels, nanofiction, which is sort of this new like 1 to 3 sentence story, flash fiction, which is less than 300 words, and I'm sure there will be inevitably more versions of fiction. For example, there's some kinds of fiction that are told exclusively through tweets. So I look forward to learning about new genres. Maybe you know of a new genre that you want to share down below. And there also are different genres of fiction. And so I've linked you to this website that I find interesting because they provide comics and I love comics. And so this is sort of meant to be funny, but it's also true of the different genres of fiction. You might want to take a look, maybe print it out and doodle on it for your notebook page. And then regarding the fact that short stories need conflict, I always like to show this clip from the movie adaptation, and I'd like to play it now.
Yes. Sir, what if the writer is attempting to create a story where nothing much happens, where people don't change, they don't have any epiphanies, they struggle and are frustrated and nothing is resolved? More a reflection of the real world.
The real world?
Yes, sir.
The real fucking world. First of all, you write a screenplay without conflict or crisis, you'll bore your audience to tears. Secondly, nothing happens in the world? Are you out of your fucking mind? People are murdered every day. There's genocide, war, corruption. Every fucking day, somewhere in the world, somebody sacrifices his life to save somebody else. Every fucking day, someone somewhere takes a conscious decision to destroy someone else. People find love. People lose it. For Christ's sake, a child watches a mother beaten to death on the steps of a church. Someone goes hungry. Somebody else betrays his best friend for a woman. If you can't find that stuff in life, then you, my friend, don't know crap about life. And why the fuck are you wasting my 2 precious hours with your movie? I don't have any use for it. I don't have any bloody use for it.
Okay, thanks.
So,
Hi.
I know that's a little bit aggressive, but I do think that like summarizes everything that I feel about short story, and that I really do think that good fiction needs to have conflict. And so for those who might say, well, my story is not about conflict, I would argue that it's not a story. Although I wouldn't argue it in the way that that professor did, the point is still the same. So when we're talking about short stories, I want to just share with you some terms. The first is plot. So when we say story, we're essentially talking about all of the events that affect your main character in chronological order. So the story of Nemo is that he, lost his mom at a young age. He has a great relationship with his dad. He gets lost, he gets found, etc., etc. The plot, however, is the order in which the events are revealed. So the events of your short story are revealed. So while Nemo is born, his mom is lost, then he is lost, then he is found. While that might be the order of his life, that's not necessarily the order in which we understand the story. Sure, we get a little bit of backstory of Nemo in the beginning, but then when Nemo is lost, we don't necessarily see what's happening to him for the whole movie. We're more with Marlin, Nemo's dad. And so that's the idea of plot. That plot is interested in the action and less interested in the chronology. Plot is what gives meaning to your story. Another really popular example is of the Hitchcock film Psycho. So within the first 30 minutes of Psycho, the main character is murdered. And so technically you would think if her story ends, that the entire film should end, but in fact, it doesn't, because there's still action, there are still events that need to be revealed, and that's why plot is different than story. Along with that, when you're thinking of plot, you're always thinking of the order of events that you're going to reveal through storytelling. And so this is a very popular pyramid that lays out a plot structure. So first you have exposition. That's where you reveal a little bit of backstory of your character. Maybe the character's world, maybe character's family life, whatever the case may be. Then you establish a clear want for your character, and the rising action is when the character tries to get this want. Um, there's obstacles along the way, and the climax is when the character is face to face with their want. They're finally going to either get their want or not get their want. And then falling action is what happens after this moment of climax, where we establish whether or not the character will get their want. And denouement is pretty much like resolution. So, you might think of Finding Nemo, Marlin, Nemo, knowing their backstory. Then Nemo is lost. So Marlin's want is to find his son, right? Rising action tries to find his son, tries to find his son, tries to find his son. He finds his son, and then they have to together. Now I'm forgetting what happens in Finding Nemo. Together they have to do stuff, and then the resolution is where we see them together again, and we realize that Marlin and Nemo have changed. We see that they've made friends. We see that Marlin is less fearful. And so that's a possible plot structure that you might use. There are also tons of other plot structures that are interesting to consider. There's the overcoming the monster. That's where your main character learns of a great evil threatening the world or the land and has to destroy this great evil. And that's like the adventure story. Think of Star Wars, think of Jaws, think of video games. Then we have rags to riches. Protagonist is suppressed and ridiculed, but through a series of actions is able to become a mature, powerful protagonist. This maturity is usually represented through wealth acquisition or a mate, i.e. Aladdin or Cinderella. And if you'd like to offer some of your own examples as comments down below, please do. Then we have the quest or the journey. This is where the protagonist learns of something. This motivates them to go on a journey to find out more. The journey usually involves meeting some friends, and then the something learned must occur at the beginning of the story, setting off a chain of events. So the best example of this is Lord of the Rings. Voyage and return is where you meet the protagonist on his way to a strange new land. And when I say strange new land, you don't have to think only in terms of Lord of the Rings. Strange new land is basically any new world for the character. It can be going to Target if they've never been, right? We follow the protagonist as he learns about this land and its absurdities and rules. The protagonist ultimately returns home changed. So Alice in Wonderland, Finding Nemo, right? Nemo comes home changed after learning about, life in the aquarium. Back to the Future might be a dated reference, but if you're interested, you should watch the film and then it'll make more sense. And of course, Toy Story. Another kind of plot structure is the comedy plot structure. This involves characters separating, characters being uncertain, characters being frustrated. It's essentially the idea is two people who are trying to be together but can't because of some dark force. And the whole plot follows the two trying to get together. And this dark force, it sounds like it wouldn't be funny, but the dark force it can just be anything that keeps these two people together. Often it can lead to maybe physical humor in that like they're physically separated. It can be a person that's like a comic figure that keeps these two people separated. Comedy is a really hard thing to write, and I would recommend if you're interested in writing a funny short story or a comedy that you read some examples of comic short stories first. Okay, so then after we've covered plot structure, the other really important thing to understand is scene. Now, every short story must have a scene. Scene is different from summary. Scene is the present tense of your story. It's where your characters interact. It's like a close-up shot, or you can imagine it's where we see the action happening. So summary might look like this, where it's very distant, and we might say, he cut the tree. Scene is where we're close up and understand sort of more sensory details. A story, again, must have scene. If you don't have scene in your story, you don't have a story, you have only a summary. Another way to look at it is summary is the past of your story. It can catch your reader up to what has happened before the plot starts. So for example, Joanna worked for years searching for the right job until she finally found the rabbit hole. So that's a summary sentence that catches us up with what's been happening with Joanna. Summary can also close time gaps between scenes. She searched for him that whole week with no luck. Again, this might seem kind of familiar when we were talking about showing and telling. One reason we said you might want to tell instead of show is when you're dealing with time. So again, summary is essentially telling while scene is showing. And an example I have here is of why scene is important is in reference to Jersey Shore, which I realize now might be a super, again, dated example. But Jersey Shore is a reality show, or think of any reality show really. If you had a whole reality show in which you just had characters in the confessional booth talking about what happened, and we never actually have footage of what was happening, of them interacting, you wouldn't really have a great reality show. So that's what scene and summary is. Summary is where you have the characters in the confessional booth or the narrator in the confessional booth talking about what's been going on, and scene is where we see the actual footage. I really like, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I really like the example of Disney movies when thinking about the difference between summary and scene, and also in thinking about how summary can be told in a very interesting way. So in Hercules, the first 2.5 minutes essentially give us a summary of all that's been going on, so that they can immediately start the scenes and show us the story of Hercules. And so I just want to
age of powerful gods and extraordinary heroes. And the greatest and strongest of all these heroes was the mighty Hercules. But what is the measure of a true hero? Now, that is what our story is.
Will you listen to him? He's making the story sound like some Greek tragedy.
Lighten up, dude.
We'll take it from here, darling.
You go, girl.
We are the muses, goddesses of the arts, and proclaimers of heroes.
Heroes like Hercules.
Honey, you mean Hercules. I'd like to make some sweet music. Our story actually begins long before Hercules, many eons ago. Back when the world was new.
All right. Well, it's linked here, so if you want to watch the whole thing, by all means, go for it. But so you'll see that they kind of poke fun at the traditional, summary telling that's boring, and so then they.
Just to confirm.
Oops.
You'd like to call Paris.
That's my Siri.
Go ahead.
It makes fun of that idea, and instead we have summary through song. Okay. So in thinking about scene and summary, one other tool that you have, or one other craft element, is backstory. Backstory is basically exposition. It's where you reveal the biography of your characters. And I would just advise you that backstory is not an essential part of storytelling. You can show us your character's biography through dialogue, through objects, through narrative. Also, be mindful, we don't necessarily need to know everything that's happened in your character's life. We really need to focus on the plot that you're developing through scenes. So, and I have an example of this from Twilight. Like, would it matter if you knew that Edward Cullen dressed up as a ballerina when he was 6 years old? Not really, because the plot, the story that the author wants to tell is not of his life as a kid, but as a present-day vampire and his romance with Bella. So again, thinking about what is a necessary part of your character's biography that needs to be shown, and what are some parts that it's okay if we leave out. Another kind of tool you have is the flashback. That's where you, either through italics or through maybe asterisks, go back in time. Films and books that do this, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close does this when it has flashbacks to 9/11. American History X has this. The way that they show the flashbacks is in black and white. Memento has this as well. These two are films, by the way. The advantages of flashback is it can help readers understand the present better. It can complicate a character. The setback of flashback is it can sometimes be confusing if it's not clear when a flashback is happening. And also, if a flashback is just happening for the sake of a flashback, but there's no real point or nothing really new is discovered, then the flashback can feel kind of cheap. A great story that I didn't assign, but that you should consider reading is by Amy Fawn. It's called Miss Lien, and it's really told through a series of flashbacks, and it's done incredibly well. So if you're interested in using flashbacks, you might want to read something like that to learn from it. So effectively using flashbacks, you want to just make sure formatting wise it's clear, space breaks. The other thing is, how do you jump into a flashback? Sometimes a sight, like an image that the character is seeing in the present day, can trigger the memory that leads into the flashback. And it's also important to maybe alert us when we're moving in time. And one way to alert us is through setting. So maybe the world looks different. Maybe seasons change. And I mentioned this before, American History X uses black and white and color to show us when we're going back and forward in time. And just to recap, a story must have at least one scene. Scene is how you show, summary is when you're telling. So if scene is how you show, then what needs to be incorporated in a scene is dialogue, action, and narrative. So characters need to be interacting with each other and doing things. And so speaking of doing things, who does these things in stories but the character? And so that's the next important part of short story writing, the character. Why? If short stories have to contain conflict, a key way to create conflict is to develop characters. A key way to ensure your short story has change is to create characters who want something and try to get this something, and through this action of getting their want, they change. And so the first thing I want to share with you is in your stories, your character, your main character, maybe even several of your characters should have a want. And this want has to be tangible. That means if you go back to when we were talking about abstractions, you want a want that's not an abstraction but a concrete idea. So you don't want my character wants happiness. You could have, though, my character wants a new job, or my character wants to have a child, right? And the other important thing to remember is the minute you establish your character's want, you also need to figure out how your character is going to attempt to get this want, because a story can't just be a character wanting something without ever really going out and trying to get this something. Now, of course, they can try to get this job, they can try to get this baby and fail, but they need to try, otherwise we don't have a clear story. So you might, as a comment, think about characters in film or literature that you know of. What were their wants? What do they do to achieve these wants? And how are they changed because of either getting this want or trying to get this want? Okay, and now part of developing a fully dimensional character is to think about 5 things. First, what does your character look like? What does your character sound like? That's voice. And if you remember when we were talking about poetry, voice considers diction, perspective, and rhythm. What does your character want? Who gets in the way of your character achieving their want? It's okay if maybe the character gets in the way of their want, like they get in their own way. Action, what does the character do to get his or her want? So this is Norman Bates from Psycho. So thinking, what does he look like? You might describe him as creepy looking, a smirk that is supposed to make you feel comfortable, but it only makes you feel more uncomfortable. If you watch the film, you might have a better understanding of what he sounds like. What does he want? It seems like he wants, what does he want really? It seems like he wants to keep his mother alive, or he wants to, well, he certainly wants to kill people. So I guess there's that. There's more complicated ways to read Psycho, but I'm drawing a blank right now, so forgive me. I think I want to go to Nemo, which is an easier example. So Nemo, his image, he has one fin, right? His voice, it's very childlike, right? He is a child after all. His conflict, he wants to be independent. He wants to be able to do things on his own. I think he even wants to just be able to go to school and just have his father trust that he'll be okay. He doesn't really, I guess if you think about it, he doesn't go for this want on his own as much as he's thrown into a situation where he has to be on his own. But it still works. It's a fully dimensional character. You could do the same thing with Spider-Man, Hannibal, any character you think of. I'm sure you could break it down into these 5 dimensions. And these are some questions that you can ask when you're reading a story that has a fully dimensionalized character. I won't read through this. I'll just let you read through it. Okay. And I think this is going to be the last thing that we talk about, and that is point of view. So if you remember, I said that a scene has to contain dialogue, which is its own lesson, so you've learned about that. It needs action, which is characters interacting with each other. So we've talked about characters and what how to establish fully realized or fully developed characters. But then it also needs narrative. So when I say narrative, I mean a clear point of view. And so point of view is the who and the when of the perspective that tells the story. So there are a bunch of options you have as to who will tell the story. It's not necessary that your character tells the story. It can be someone that the character knows who's telling the story. It can be a very objective reporter who sort of is like this godlike figure that sees everything. It can be maybe a second person point of view in which there's a bunch of yous, so the reader almost becomes the narrator. I want to just walk through all of the possibilities more clearly, and I want you to think about what point of view your short story will have. So first person central is when the central character, that means the protagonist, is the one telling the story. So the character who it has the wand, who the story is following, is the person who tells the story. An example of this would be Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So it's about him cutting school and he tells the story. By the way, first person central is the most popular point of view to use. The cool parts of first person is you really get to play around with voice because you can have a very interesting character with a very dynamic voice. Another cool thing about first person central is you could develop an unreliable narrator because maybe the character is trying to tell us a story that he believes or she believes but isn't actually the truth. And so part of the story becomes the reader figuring that out. But some of the shortfalls of first person is it can end up being a lot of the character talking, but not a lot of doing. So you just want to be mindful of that. First person peripheral, it's where you have an outside character who's in the story, but it's not the main character, and they're the ones that are telling the story. So the best example would be Nick Carraway from Great Gatsby. He's not the protagonist, Jay Gatsby is, and yet he's the one that tells the story. The cool part about first person peripheral is it helps the reader see the main character in a way that the main character wouldn't be able to describe themselves, right? Because it's hard for a first person narrator to describe themselves in that way. The weird part about first person peripheral is you really need to figure out a character who would logistically be able to see important parts of the main character's story, right? So like, in other words, if you want a peripheral character to tell the story of your main character who's a janitor and wants to get a date with some girl, how are you going to have this peripheral character tell the story? Like, how are they able to get access to this main character's world? So that's just something to think about. And like I mentioned before, first person narrators, there is a chance they're unreliable. If you have an unreliable narrator, just be sure that it is in some ways clear to the reader, and also be sure it's clear why the reader should still go on and listen to the story from this unreliable narrator's perspective. And so the best example I have is of Forrest Gump. It's clear that Forrest Gump's point of view is a little bit unreliable, and yet we still proceed to watch the film. And it's mostly because we're so convinced that he believes this is real. And the story is not about necessarily whether or not what he's saying is true, but in understanding Forrest Gump's sort of maturity and coming of age. Second person, that's where the narrator is you. It's essentially where you force the reader to participate. This is, I think, the only good example I can find from Junot Diaz's Alma. And I'll let you read it on your own because I will be sharing this PowerPoint with you. But you'll see that one weird part or interesting part of second person is it forces the reader to participate in something that maybe they don't want to participate in. And so it immediately creates a connection between reader and character. But like I said before, I'm not really seeing second person done incredibly well. So just make sure there's a reason why you're using second person if you choose to use it. Third person omniscient is where the narrator is not the character in a story. Instead, the narrator is like a camera reporting from up top. This camera is able to know and see everything. They're able to know everyone's thoughts. They're able to know everyone's actions. Third person omniscient is, I think, what we typically read in literature, like in novels. It gives you so much access. The tricky part of third person omniscient is you need to be consistent. So if you in the beginning start by talking about everyone's thoughts and what everyone is doing, you really need to stay with that. It can't be that all of a sudden you drop everyone and you then focus just on one character. So that becomes a little bit of a commitment. Third person limited, it's essentially the same as third person omniscient, except you're really just focusing on one or two characters' thoughts or actions. So it's the same thing. It's the narrator is not a character in the story, but the narrator is sort of this camera from up top who has access to only a few characters' thoughts and actions. So Harry Potter would be one example of that kind of narrative. Then we have third person objective. This is where you have a camera who's only able to report on what the camera sees. So think of like the paranormal movies where essentially the movie is only what the camera captures. So the narrator would focus on what people are doing, what people are saying, but they're not able to share what characters are thinking because they don't have access to that. Third person objective is really great in horror films. Third person objective is also really cool, I think, if you're really interested in developing a story solely through dialogue. So if you remember Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, I think that's a really great example, or well, you haven't read it yet, but when you read it, that's a really great example of third person objective in which the whole story is really about two people talking, and so it would kind of ruin it if we knew what these characters were thinking, because part of the story is trying to figure out what they're thinking solely through what they're saying to each other. The other part of point of view is you want to figure out what is the relationship the narrator has to the time of the story. Is the narrator telling the story as though it's happened 5 years ago? Is the narrator telling the story as it's actually unfolding? Or is maybe this like some fantasy piece and the narrator is telling a story that hasn't even occurred yet, right? So these are some things you want to think about. It's important that you're consistent. So if you're going to tell it in present tense, cool, but just make sure you're consistently telling it in present tense. And so just to wrap up, in terms of what I hope you've taken away from this, what I hope is not too long of a lecture, I hope you recognize that a short story is the genre that we're working with in the next couple of days. You're going to be writing scenes, but you're also going to be writing a short story. And this short story, hopefully you see, requires some kind of structure. Whatever structure you choose is fine, but it should be clear what the character's want is, and also sort of what the climax is. A short story requires scenes. A short story requires a character that has a want, and a short story requires a clear point of view. And that is all for now. I look forward to seeing you next time.